Hello, kia ora Perth friends. I am Gracie Mackenzie. Just to let you know a little bit about me, I am a Fijian Kiwi. I'm married to a ginger named Cam. Yes, that is his sword in the background. We got given that for our wedding 4 years ago by a friend who makes swords. So the two of us, we work with students at Otago University, which is in the bottom of New Zealand, if my accent hasn't given me away completely. And although we've called Dunedin home for the last 4 years, my childhood spanned Fiji, Melbourne, Darwin, and the Middle East. We lived in the United Arab Emirates for a while. So some things that I love, road trips. I love reading anything by C.S. Lewis or Tim Keller, and I love the band Need to Breathe. So something about 2020 that's worth knowing. I decided this was the year I wanted to learn how to tell better stories. And so in the last couple of months, I have actually started up a blog with one of my best mates, who also happens to be a ginger. I will share my screen so I can show you a photo of my family. Cool, here we go. All right, that is us. So obviously it's Cam and me in the middle. It's my dad, my mama, they live in Australia, they're actually Mount Isa, and then my siblings. So yeah, when Josh asked if I would be up for speaking at your weekly meeting, I was excited. But then I realised that if I was going to do it live, it meant starting at 11 p.m. New Zealand time. And I told Josh I don't offer anything of value to the world after 9 p.m. So we have gone with the recorded route. All right, guys. So tonight we're talking forgiveness, specifically why it's worthwhile and how to make a habit of it. I'll start by getting personal. So on Father's Day a few weeks ago, I released a video where I described some of the journey that I went through to reconcile with my dad after some pretty devastating events came to light in 2014. I'm about to share that video with you guys now. So it's an 8-minute clip, and what I want you to do at the end is just take a couple minutes to chat with someone nearby about what stood out to you from that story about forgiveness.
Shall we do this, Dad?
Let's do this, darling.
People tell me I'm the spitting image of my mum. I've learnt to take the compliment, but as a girl, what I really wanted to hear was how much I resembled my dad. He was my hero, generous, inclusive, empathetic, and yeah, whether it was savouring gelato or admiring clouds, we shared a delight in all things beautiful. And that extended to God. I remember as a teen, I walked into the lounge early one morning and I found my dad there just singing passionately to Jesus. And over the years, it's a passion that I came to share, as did my mum, my brother, and my twin sisters. Some of my favourite memories of us are just sitting around the table singing in thanks to God, except for my brother who took up guitar. When I was in my 3rd year at university, we made a discovery that pretty much ripped my family apart.
It turned out that over the previous decade, my dad had damaged himself and my family in a number of significant ways. In the aftermath, my mum was deeply grieved.
My brother and one of my sisters promptly forgave him and just avoided the subject. My younger sister came pretty close to driving herself and my parents off a bridge at one point. And I just wanted to make Dad hurt and feel something of the pain that he caused us. It was about that time I went to the library. I was supposed to write an essay, but what came out was a poem where I really wrestled with the conflicting pulls to punish my dad and to forgive him. Quite frankly, forgiveness was the last thing I felt like doing. My anger felt like power, and letting go, it felt emotionally impossible. But in the midst of it, I really sensed God just gently convincing me of two things. One was that I was actually being controlled by my bitterness, and it was a savage and toxic boss. The second thing, and this was harder to swallow, was that there was a way in which I was actually in the same boat as my dad.
I hadn't done what he had.
But deep down I knew that I had betrayed God and disrespected other people in really serious ways. And despite that, Jesus had still suffered the most horrific death so that I could be forgiven and I could be reconciled with him. It took a while to get there, but I came to see that actually I had no moral high ground to look down at my dad from. And that realization, that really was the clincher for me. And with it, I remember just praying and being like, God, I need your help to forgive because I just don't have it in me. And I got to test that prayer a few weeks later when I met up with my dad for the first time since the news had broken. That night it's etched in my memory. We sat awkwardly in this red leather booth. I remember the sort of sick feeling in my stomach as I looked up and just asked, Dad, what happened? He was quiet for a bit, and then haltingly he shared his story, and there were no excuses given. I could see the remorse in his face. I could hear it in his voice. And when he finished, we sat silently and with pounding hearts and wet cheeks. I'd never seen him that vulnerable. And I knew that that was my moment. If I wanted to drive the dagger deep, I could do it then. Instead, I inhaled, I looked him in the eye, and I said, Dad, I forgive you, and I still respect you. I hadn't planned on that, but as I did, two things happened. My dad began bawling like a baby, and I felt just this weight lift off me. I've never really experienced anything like it. But that night we were reconciled and I was free. In the years that followed, my mum chose the redemptive path of forgiveness. And with professional help, with a lot of support from friends, with prayer, they continue to grow and to journey together. They're actually in a place where they're supporting other couples who are going through similar heartache. For me, as powerful as that night was in the booth, healing's been ongoing.
I still get hit with waves of grief out of nowhere. My husband's gotten good at holding me while I cry.
But despite it all, now my dad and I are closer than we were before. I love being with him. He walked me down the aisle when I got married. I can't wait for him to hold my babies eventually. And when I think of how dramatically I've healed and how deeply my family has been transformed and reconciled, it's not grief that fills me. It's gratitude. And I give thanks to Jesus for it. My name is Gracie Mackenzie, and this is my journey of hope.
The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will our shield and portion be, as long as life endures. As long as life endures.
Cool. All right. Hey, thanks for taking the time to watch that. I think if you've been human for more than a few years, you'll have been in all sorts of situations where you needed to ask forgiveness from someone. You might be able to think of a few recent examples off the top of your head. Maybe it was a snarky remark you made to a sibling. Maybe it was that time where you just completely disregarded what your boyfriend or girlfriend wanted and made sure you got your own way. Maybe you've been that flatmate who's gone weeks on end without doing any chores despite repeated requests to pull your weight. I think, if we're brutally honest, there are plenty of times where we've dished out insults and we've demonstrated disrespect to others, when we've neglected or, looked down judgmentally on people. And if our life records were somehow made public, there would even be times where we have betrayed others' trust and actually done deep damage to them. And then there are the times when we've been on the receiving end of that ourselves. Maybe you know what it's like to be bullied or ignored, excluded at school. Maybe you've been insulted by uni classmates who disagreed with your stance on something. Maybe you've even been cheated on by a partner or abused by someone that you trusted, or you've lost someone in your family to a drunk driver. Maybe you've got beef not just with one person, but with an entire group of people, say the church, or the government with their historic injustice towards, the Indigenous people. Maybe there's an ethnic group that's been responsible for carrying out atrocities against people that you love. And obviously there's quite a spectrum of wrongs that I've just described. But I guess my question for you guys is this: how do you typically respond when you are wronged, or when someone that you love is wronged? Are you a retaliator? Maybe that's, lashing out with words, or making sure other people know just how awful that person is who hurt you. Perhaps it's even emotionally withdrawing as punishment. Do you find ways to try and get even? Are you an avoider? Do you tend to just sweep hurts under the rug, try not to think about them, don't go there with the person that's hurt you? Maybe you're a bit more of a minimizer. You're just trying to convince yourself, hey, look, it actually wasn't that big a deal. I'm overreacting. You tell yourself to take a concrete pill and just move on. Or have you made a habit of practicing forgiveness, where you actually do the hard yards to process the hurt and the anger in healthy ways, and actually absorb the pain of that injury, while releasing whoever hurt you from having to pay. I actually want you guys to take a couple minutes, just pause this recording and just share what your sort of typical hurt default is with somebody around you. So do you tend to retaliate, avoid, minimize, or forgive? What's your go-to? Okay, well, as you saw in the video that we played earlier, when I'm not relying on the Holy Spirit, my usual default when I'm hurt is a blend of retaliating by withdrawing emotionally, or kind of just avoiding the person, trying not to go there. And my motto when hurts is basically to just inflict pain and wallow in resentment. So hopefully that's not where you guys are going to stay, but you might be able to relate to that. Oh, hello, excuse me. And so I guess in the next few minutes, I'm just going to share what I hope you find are some compelling reasons to make a habit of forgiving, as well as some insights and just some practical steps that have actually helped me to do it. So I'll be doing this from a Christian perspective, but I hope that wherever you're at on your spiritual journey, that you will find something beneficial here. So this is a fair question. Why bother forgiving? It's definitely not instinctive, put it that way. But I guess there's all sorts that could be said. I just want to suggest 3 powerful motivators. And I'm going to start with pure pragmatics. I just realized that's in your way. Excuse me, team. And so I think, forgiveness is worthwhile because it is literally healthier for you and for everyone around you. And it actually makes you, in the long run, more human, and it stops the spread of toxicity. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you go and actually look at some of the research coming out from the scientists, coming out from sociologists, counselors, psychiatrists, the whole shebang, the conclusion that they have come to is that, people who hold on to unforgiveness and bitterness, they actually experience the toxic effects in their bodies and their mental and emotional well-being. They experience it bleeding into and actually destroying their relationships. And it's just, the effects are so destructive. There's actually a book by a doctor called, he's Dr. McMillan. He talks about how resentment is actually implicated in many different diseases. And the thing is that, over time, unforgiveness actually makes you less human. In other words, it dehumanizes you. If you choose to seek ways to make the perpetrators suffer for what they have done, it's going to undo you in the long run. You can avoid relationship. You can kind of actively initiate, or maybe just passively hope for some sort of horrible circumstance to befall them. For them to go through the same kind of pain that you have experienced because of them. You can viciously confront them, being hurtful with what you say. You can go around their back and try and, ruin their reputation with others. And if they suffer, you may start to feel a sense of satisfaction, they're paying off their debt, they're getting what they deserved. But Tim Keller, he points out some problems with this option. He says, you may become harder and colder, more self-pitying, and therefore more self-absorbed. If the wrongdoer was someone with a lot of money or someone in authority, you might instinctively dislike and resist that sort of person for the rest of your life. If it was somebody of a different race or a gender, you could become permanently cynical and prejudiced against people of that race or people of that gender. And I think even more than that, if the perpetrator and their family and their friends feel like they have the right to respond to your payback, you just get these cycles of retaliation and reaction that can go on for years and straight up, in some cases, generations. And I think the thing to remember, you might have been on the receiving end of evil, but when you try and get payment through revenge, that evil doesn't disappear or somehow get cancelled out. It actually spreads. And most tragically of all, it spreads into you and into your own character. I think the thing on the flip side that's worth recognizing, according to Harvard Health, again, just kind of referencing some of those studies, they talk about how different observational studies and randomized trials that they've done link forgiveness to lower levels of depression, lower levels of anxiety and hostility. There's reduced substance abuse, there's higher self-esteem, and there's greater life satisfaction. And that's just from the scientists. I think it actually, when I think about these things, it reminds me of what Jesus talks about in John chapter 10, where he says, the reason I come is so that people can have life and they can actually have it to the full. And so you kind of see here, if he's telling us to do anything, forgiving being one of those things, it's really for our own thriving. So that's I think one decent reason to actually make a habit of forgiving. It makes you more human. It stops the spread of toxicity. The second is this. Hang on. It really comes back to just because of how extravagantly we have been forgiven by God. At the end of the day, we have grieved, we've wronged, we've dishonored God immeasurably more than anyone else will ever do to us. And even so, he completely forgives us when we put our trust in Jesus. And then he instructs us, he says, hey guys, if you belong to me, if you're my followers, then you need to go do the same thing. You got to be people that forgive. There's a really beautiful verse in Colossians written to a group of early Christians, young Christians, are trying to figure out, how do we live now that we're following Jesus? And it says this, it says, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, put on compassion, put on kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another. And if one has a complaint against another, forgive each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. Forgiveness it comes back to an identity thing. If we are children of God, if we're followers of Jesus, we're told to forgive so that we can follow God's example and that we can thrive and the people around us can too. So that's our second reason, because of how lavishly God has forgiven us. The third is this. Because it shows the world how ridiculously good God is. What do I mean by that? Well, a couple of things. When we choose forgiveness, we actually preserve relational unity. And, relational unity is important just in general for people to thrive, for society to work well, but it is especially paramount for marriages, for families, and for the body of Christ, the church. If you go and check out the prayer that Jesus prays the night before his death in John 17, you'll see just how much unity among Christians matters to him, and how it's meant to imitate the Trinitarian dynamic of unity amongst the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. When we forgive, especially when we forgive things that are really damaging and really just wrong, that takes supernatural empowering. And when we do it, it shows the world that God is alive and God is working. I hope that if there's anything you took from my family's story, it's this, that it was God who brought about that kind of supernatural healing and transformation that you got a little taster of. I think of the Westminster Catechism, which is just a funny word for, essentially it's talking about, the essentials of Christian belief and practice. And the Catechism asks this question. It says, what is the chief end of man? Maybe in our normal language we'd say, what is the point of human existence? And the answer that it gives is this. It says humanity's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And forgiveness, that is something that glorifies God. It demonstrates his supreme value when we obey him, and we show our love through actually acting on what he's told us to do. But it also shows his power to change us and do something that, humanly speaking, we can't really. It frees us up to be able to enjoy God. And so when we forgive, we're becoming who we were designed to be as humans, and we're showing off the goodness of God to the world. So that is this in a nutshell. 3 key reasons why forgiveness is worth the pain involved. It's worth it because it's healthier for you over time. Bitterness is going to dehumanize you. It's going to spread toxicity. It's worth it because of how extravagantly we've been forgiven by God. He calls us as his kids to do the same for others. And it's worth it because, as we just talked about, it shows the world how ridiculously good God is. It gives others a real tangible picture of God's character and his power. And it actually, forgiving others brings God glory. So, okay, I've done a bit of talking, and at this point you might be thinking, rightio, Grace, there's some decent reasons to forgive, but where do I start when forgiveness feels undeserved or just emotionally impossible? That is a fair question. How do we fully forgive? And I'm just going to briefly touch on a few things, sort of practicalities, but I want to ground them in saying that, for true healing and freedom to take place, and not just sort of a fake forgiveness that doesn't actually deal with the root pain, that takes dependence on the Holy Spirit every step of the way. It's not something that we can actually achieve through willpower alone. So I'll just preface that, and we look at the hows with that. But I want to start with a quote. Of course, it's by Tim Keller. He is my fave. But he says this. He says, God's grace and forgiveness, while free to the recipient, they are always costly for the giver. When you forgive, that means that you absorb the loss and you absorb the debt. You bear it yourself. So all forgiveness is costly. And in light of that, he's making the connection here. Forgiveness equals it's taking on the pain yourself, absorbing it. And so I would start. My photo's disappeared. I don't know where it's gone. But I would start with processing your pain and your anger with God and a few trusted other people. Again, to quote Tim Keller, forgiveness means refusing to make someone pay for what they did. But if you're going to refrain from lashing out when everything in you wants to do that, that is actually a form of agony and suffering, because you're not only suffering the original loss of happiness or reputation or opportunity, but from now on you're foregoing the consolation of inflicting the same on the person that did it. You absorb the debt and you take the cost of it onto yourself completely instead of taking it out on the other person. And that hurts terribly. In fact, many people would say it feels like a kind of death, which it is in a sense, but it's the kind of death that actually leads to resurrection, and instead of the lifelong living death of cynicism and bitterness. So I would say, guys, and this is something that I had to do a lot of when I first found out about my dad's affairs, was actually just pouring out my heart to God. And for me, that looked like journaling, it looked like raging, it looked like writing and crying. And then eventually doing that with, he was my boyfriend at the time, but Cam, and just a few people that I knew I could trust, just to be really raw with. But, it'll look different depending on your personality and just who you are. For some of us, it means we needed to vent or maybe lament. Maybe it's over coffee, or maybe it's smashing a few plates. Whatever it is that you need to do in order to process those feelings in a healthy way, do it. And don't do it solo. Don't keep those thoughts and feelings in the dark. The other thing that was really huge for me, and that I know others across the centuries, the years, have found really helpful when they've been injured, is actually taking time to reflect on how much God has forgiven you. Think about it. Like, what are you most grateful that God doesn't hold against you anymore? And why? Why is that you're thankful about that? How would life be different if God didn't forgive you? And if you're brave, why don't you can invite the Holy Spirit to actually show you how He thinks and how He feels about your sin, about the attitudes or the behaviors that you have that totally hurt and disrespect God and other people. And I think the thing you'll find is, as your understanding of just how horrific your own sin is grows, the more you're able to really appreciate God's forgiveness, and the better you're in a position to offer it to other people. If you think you're a pretty decent person, maybe you'll intellectually agree at a head level that, sure, you're sinful, but if your heart hasn't been broken by the horror of your own sin, then you're really going to struggle to forgive others. The last thing I would encourage you to do is to commit yourself both to the act and the ongoing process of forgiveness. There's a guy he's a doctor, he's Tyler Vanderweel. He works at the Harvard School of Public Health. And he talks about how, there's actually two sides to forgiveness. There's decisional and there's emotional. And so decisional forgiveness, that involves a conscious choice to replace ill will with goodwill. Where, you no longer wish for bad things to happen to that individual or group of people. And of the two, sort of decisional, emotional, decisional is often quicker and easier to accomplish. He gives an example of actually, writing about your forgiveness in a journal or a letter that you don't send, or telling your friends. That can actually help with the decisional side of forgiveness. In terms of the emotional side, this takes a bit longer. And what you're doing here is you're moving away from the negative feelings so that you're no longer dwelling on the wrongdoing. The reason it takes longer is, no surprises here, but those emotions can kind of resurge at different points in time, quite regularly. And, this can happen when maybe you're thinking about the offender, or there's something that triggers the memory, or you're experiencing the fallout from, the adverse consequences of what they did. But I think Dr. Vanderweel gives a helpful clarification. He says, forgiveness is not erasure. It's actually about changing your reaction to those memories. When those bad feelings crop up, it's reminding yourself that you've chosen forgiveness, you've made that decision, and ultimately you want good for the offender. Or maybe more honestly, you want to want good. And that's where you're asking for the Lord's help with that one. It may help to actually revisit that commitment that you made to forgive. Go back to that journal entry, or recall that shared conversation with a friend. So I just want to end with some final wisdom from Tim Keller. And he says this: if you simply refuse to take vengeance on the wrongdoer in action and even in your inner fantasies, the anger slowly begins to subside because you're not giving any fuel. And so the resentment will burn lower and lower. Forgiveness, you actually have to, it must be granted before it can be felt, but it does come eventually. And it leads to a new peace, a resurrection. And it's the only way to stop the spread of evil. So that's all from me, guys. Thanks heaps for listening and engaging. I wish I could be in there on those conversations, but yeah, I'm really praying that God would use my story, use this talk to, just your group discussions as well, to really bring new depths of freedom for you guys as you make a habit of forgiveness. So cheers, and then enjoy the discussion questions here.